Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on Britain today. Today I'm going to be talking you through some of the issues currently at play in the United Kingdom. So let's have a look at the key terms and then we'll just go through them one by one. So let's have a look at some of our key terms for this lecture. We will focus on Brexit, what happened, why and what now. I'll have a look at some of the key players in politics today, so Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. We'll have a look at some of the situations that have led to protests, for instance, the culture wars going on in the United Kingdom at the moment. And we'll have a brief look at some of the royal scandals of the last couple of years. There's also a slide on the British press. And remember that this PowerPoint includes videos on different topics that I won't be playing during my talk. That would just make the PowerPoint too long, but please do have a look, check them out. They are meant to help you and they can explain some things much better and quicker than we can. So first up, Brexit. In the 2016 referendum, 52% of voters voted leave. Why? Why would Britain vote to leave the United Kingdom? So let's have a look at the next couple of slides. We'll go into what they were expecting and what's actually happened. So slide 1. Why did Britain vote to leave the European Union? So one of the reasons, again, read the book, not everything is in this PowerPoint, is that people thought that Britain was too big and too important. Remember, they have a history of being a massive, very powerful empire. They're still a powerful nation, and they felt that they were too big and too important. And they didn't feel that they belonged to the European Union very much anyway. You know, they're an island, they're kind of separated from the rest of it. They resented control by the European Union. They were ruled by Brussels, at least that's how they felt. It would be better for immigration levels, and they felt that there might be more possibilities for trade outside the EU if they were no longer a member of the EU. This is also to do with the fact that if you're a member of the EU, then they decide the rules, or you're supposed to maybe decide that all together. But those rules then are applicable to every member of the EU. So you don't get to make your own tax rules, you don't get to make your own trade deals. It's all within the same rules, and they didn't want that anymore. So one of the things that's important to remember, and we're now on slide 2, what did people think would happen if they voted leave, is that the slogan had been take back control. So take back control of the country and take back control of everything in it. And this did really well. So this was also Boris Johnson's sort of slogan as he was campaigning for it. That was the same thing for Theresa May before him as well. And one of the things that they did is they tried to disregard the people who were warning you about the effects of a possible leave situation, and they called this Project Fear. So these politicians who were warning you about economic effects, they were just trying to scare you. It wasn't really real. However, as we will see in the next slide with what's actually happened, they might have had a point, and maybe not. We'll have to see. Remember, this is still very fresh. 2016 seems like a long time ago, but in part because of the COVID situation, the actual implementation of Brexit took a lot longer than that. So that only started in 2020 and it's still not sorted, as we'll see. So they referred to the EU as the shackles from Brussels, or the shackles of Brussels. That's quite a name, isn't it? So if you talk about, you know, wanting to break free and take back control, the type of language that they used is very important. They also aimed their slogan at people who felt they would be better off if there would be more of something for them that they were now losing to the EU. So one of these things is money. So they campaigned with these buses that you can see in the very first slide, the title slide for this lecture. It has a bus and it says £350 million per week for the NHS. This is what we're spending on the EU now. Let's spend it on ourselves instead. And obviously this appeals to people because the NHS is a national health service. This is something that every citizen uses. I mean, some people do have like privatized healthcare, but everybody uses the NHS, and the NHS is permanently short of money. They're always short-staffed, so any extra money that would go into that would be very appealing for people to vote for. They would also say, for instance, European subsidies. Think about farmers, think about agricultural sector. These would be people that would receive money from the EU. For instance, if you had a bad season, if your crops are bad, there would be money coming in from the EU. So these people might have been hesitant to vote leave because then they would lose out on this money. But the government promised, you know, we will meet that pound for pound. We will take over the payment of these subsidies. Don't you worry. They figured less immigration, fewer troubles, less money spent on those things. This would all be something that we could spend on ourselves. This would all be money coming in and staying in, meaning we would have more control and power. We would get to make our own trade agreements, and that meant that it would be easier also to deal with countries outside of the European Union. So all of these things together make for a pretty convincing case. Okay, so we've had a look at why the UK would decide to leave the EU, and now let's have a look at what's actually happened so far. So do remember, we're still in the midst of it. And I say we because it's both the EU and the UK. So we're still working out some of the kinks. There's a lot of kinks to be worked out. There's especially, so they've thought of some of the major agreements and the major things that they've wanted to deal with, but there's a lot of sort of admin work, computer says no, sort of systematical errors that they're still trying to sort out. And there's lots of things that they genuinely don't have an answer to yet. And that's true for both sides of the border also. So one thing is, for instance, you have to have a passport to travel to the UK. And that doesn't seem like too much of an issue because a lot of people have a passport. It's relatively easy to apply for one, especially if you're in the EU. So you could still travel quite easily. Takes a little bit longer. Security takes a little bit longer. It's a longer line. But even then, when you actually arrive at one of the airports in the UK, a lot of the times they'll just send you into the EU passport zone anyway, instead of like all passport or UK lines or something, because it's just easier to deal with. Lines are too long. Sometimes there's literally physically no space to put people. So these are tiny little things that they have to deal with now. One of the things, however, when it comes to the passports, and that is genuinely a problem, is that the rules for applying for a new passport and extending your passport are different within the EU than they are in the UK. So they have to be, they're valid for 10 years, but you can apply for an extension in advance and they will take the cutoff date of your passport and add 10 years to that. But they've been doing this for like decades now. So it can happen in some cases that your passport is technically valid for a little bit longer than 10 years when you're a UK citizen, because your new date starts at the final date that it says on your passport. But because the first time you did that, you were a bit fast maybe in your application, it's technically valid for like 10 years and 2 months, let's say, or 10 years and 2 weeks. That's not valid in the EU. So now we've had people who were at the border trying to cross the border into the European Union. For instance, in the summertime, the Brits love to go to Spain and Italy and France, and they were denied entry because their passports were technically had been valid for longer than 10 years, and that is not allowed in the EU. Another thing is international students. So now that you want to study, you can still study in the UK, obviously, but you're going to have to pay international fees. And they are much, much higher than UK fees. Now, the education system is very different in the UK anyway, and we'll get to that in a later lecture, in a later chapter, education in the United Kingdom. But one thing to know in advance, and which is already good to know, is that they set their own tuition fees. So there's a big difference in application procedures and tuition fees across the UK for different universities and colleges. And that's fine, but it does mean usually if you have an international fee, the way that the Dutch universities have the same thing for international students from outside the European Union, is that it can be like 20,000 a year to study there. So you can imagine if you wanted to study abroad, if you're within the EU, it would be so much easier paperwork wise, but also so much cheaper to choose a university that's not in the UK, because the amount of money you'd have to pay, or you're likely to have to pay, it can be astronomical. Now, another thing that's sort of related to that is, so it says up to 1 million Europeans have left the UK, and that's not because they've had to leave. So most of the people that were in the UK at the time, not so much during the referendum, but at the moment Brexit was actually implemented in 2020, were sent paperwork to apply for settled or pre-settled status. So they came up with a system that said you have to apply for this if you're a European Union citizen and you're living in the UK, you have to apply, and then if you've been there for less than 5 years, you get pre-settled status, and then if you've been there for longer than 5 years, you get settled status, and that means that you can just stay like indefinitely. So you don't have a British passport, but you have the right to live and work there indefinitely. And as long as it's not up to 5 years, so I'd been there for 2 years when in 2020 or something, so I had to apply for pre-settled status. So you had to send in proof, and especially because remember it was also COVID, so you could actually go there in person. So you had to send in proof that you'd been living and working in the UK, which meant that I had to send in Tesco receipts that I'd done my food shopping there in different places, or like that I could show a pattern. I was living near Sheffield at the time. I had the same Tesco that I always used to go to. So I would send in proof that I'd been there like every single week for the past couple of months. I had to take a picture of myself with like today's newspaper to show that I was there at that time. And then I had to have a video call with somebody. So it was absolutely ridiculous. And that made it sort of funny, but it's a very complicated system, and the paperwork was, I can imagine, was quite immense for the people doing this. And also it had to be done in quite a hurry. So you're still allowed to live and work there. Nobody really was forced to leave that was a European Union citizen and that was contributing to society. However, if you are working and living there and you're traveling back and forth between the EU and the UK, which happened for quite a lot of people, that's now no longer allowed, because you're only allowed to spend so much time, I think it's up to like 5 months or something, of the year outside of the UK. And otherwise there's a completely different system. You have to deal with a different tax system. It's the same now as when you'd move to a different country outside of the EU if you were in the Netherlands. So it's just a lot more complex. And that's also true that if you want to apply for citizenship or apply to go there for longer than a holiday, they're going to have to work with a visa system now. So like the way that the US and Australia and New Zealand do. And last I heard, they were talking about like opting for a system that's very similar to Australia and New Zealand, sort of like a points-based system where you have these different categories that you have to collect points in. So like if you're between 30 and 40, that would be the best age to move. So you would get 10 points for age. And then depending on what kind of degree you have, you get points for that. And then you have to have at least like 36 points to be allowed to apply for citizenship or for a visa, especially a visa that would even not be citizenship. So that's also a complicated system. Another thing that's important, and that's causing a lot of people a lot of distress, is the international trade problems. So yes, they can now sort of make their own rules, I suppose. They can now have their own trade deals. But for bigger companies that have branches all over the world, that would maybe not be so much of an issue. So they would, for instance, pay more for shipping. Their shipping fees would be higher. But if you're a tiny company that has to pay for shipping fee on your own, when you're sending packages or parcels across the border into the EU, it would be the same as sending a parcel into the US, for instance. And anybody who's ever done that, send parcels outside of the European Union, will know how expensive that can be. And that is one of the issues now. So if you're a tiny little company operating within the United Kingdom, it will just be too expensive to offer shipping internationally, meaning that you'd make less money. And also one of the things when it comes to shipping things internationally, and that's sort of like the bullying back and forth that I mentioned a little bit before, is if you now want to send something across the border, so companies will send lorries, big trucks full of produce and merchandise or whatever it is across the border into the European Union, for instance, or from the EU into the UK. One of the things that they started doing, especially at the beginning when they had just started, is they would check every single item in that truck, in that lorry. And you can imagine, like, if that's clothes, if that's shoes, that would be annoying. It would take forever. It caused major delays and like to the frustration of everybody involved. But imagine if that's food, if it's perishable goods, things go off. You'd have to actually bin it. So that's one of the things that they were dealing with. And also you could see like the A12, the road to Harwich to the boats, would be lined with lorries who had to like wait for the delay to end, and it could take days. They'd be sleeping there. They would get their lunch boxes checked to see if there was something in those lunch boxes that would not be allowed into the European Union, for instance. So there were a couple of instances where it was in the papers, or at least within the local papers, because I lived quite close to that place, where people were actually denied entrance with their lorries based on somebody having a cheese sandwich in their lunch, for instance. So there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of frustration, and it reached a point where people would no longer be willing to drive those trucks into the European Union or the other way around, and so they couldn't find the people. So there was a shortage of staff everywhere in every sector, especially the hospitality industry, especially, you know, the people that did actually have to leave the UK upon Brexit being implemented, meaning that they had like a lot of low-wage jobs. And lorry drivers are certainly no longer low-wage jobs now. Ads a couple of months ago promised like £80,000 a year if you were willing to drive trucks into the European Union. And then finally, well, not finally in terms of all the problems, but the last thing I'll mention is a lot of people in the UK have second homes in, for instance, Spain or France, very popular holiday destinations. And a lot of people in the EU, maybe fewer, but still people in the EU having second homes in the UK, like especially like these counties that are very popular with holidaymakers, like Cornwall, Somerset, Devon, the places where the money is. You see all these lovely cottages that you can rent and you can buy for like, $1 million. They would have these as a second home. So the rules changed, and apart from the fact that it's now no longer part of the EU, meaning you have different tax laws, meaning that you have to probably change the way that you're paying these things. There's also the fact that you're now no longer allowed to sublet it when you're not in it, or you can only sublet it when it's for 6 months or more, meaning that you cannot rent it out to holidaymakers. If you own a second home in the UK, or if you're a UK citizen owning a second home in Spain, the rules have become so complicated that loads of people were forced or felt forced to sell their second houses. So final Brexit slide, what does the future hold? So The Guardian does a podcast. If anybody's very interested in this, The Guardian does a podcast that's available on Spotify. I'm sure it's also available on Apple Music or whatever you're using. And they've been talking a lot about possible future effects of Brexit and everything that's been happening so far. So one of the things that I liked that they said is it's not so much a fall off a cliff. People in advance were warning you, like the economy will crash, it will be like a disaster, you'll feel it immediately. And so far people have said, have we really? If you don't own a business, if you're not trying to study abroad, if you don't have a second home, if you're just like a plain old citizen, are you really going to notice immediately? And they said, no, maybe not really. It's not so much a fall off a cliff, but it's like a slow puncture. So export has dropped by 25% compared to their European counterparts. The British economy has declined significantly. So we are going to notice, and we'll notice it in the long term more than anything else. So one of the things that happened is the agricultural farmers subsidies from the EU that I mentioned before, where the government promised we'll take over, we'll meet it pound for pound. That didn't actually happen. So they are now being subsidized, at least in part, by the UK government, but it took a long time. So it's like 2.5, 3 years onward now. It took a very long time. So when they went back to the rural areas, which is where most of the Leave voters were or are, in, for instance, Wales and Scotland, and in England, like in the north of England as well, they went back and said, if you had to vote again, would you now vote to leave the EU, yes or no? And most of the people said no. So if there had been a second referendum, probably would have voted remain. But obviously that wasn't done, and that would not be a very believable situation. Like, all your credibility is gone if you have a referendum and then don't do what people have said and then do it again. So which is why they haven't done it. And also because the government, that was Boris Johnson's government who got it done. His tagline was get Brexit done, and he did. They would never have done that. But a lot of the people that voted leave in the first place actually Googled the next day. So the next day, the headline was that the most Googled term in the UK the day after the Brexit vote was, what is Brexit? Which also tells you that people maybe didn't really know what they were voting for. They just liked, they found the campaign appealing, they liked the sound of it. But upon second thought, they probably would not have voted leave. So a slow puncture. You're going to notice, but it's going to take a little bit longer. And one of the issues is also the UK government hasn't been that concerned with green environmental issues, like green goals for the government anyway. But that's even more difficult now. So they don't really have those natural resources. They're dependent on import for a lot of those things. So if you have to find new trade deals, can you really afford to think about how green those goals can be? So that's something that they have to consider. There's the immigration levels, the migrants coming in, especially if they're crossing the channel from France. So between France and the UK, there's this sort of standoff. Which is why that picture's in the PowerPoint, I'm not making fun, is sort of okay, they're on your part of the water, they are your responsibility. No, they're on your part of the water, so it's your responsibility. And so whose is it? And what are you going to do with the people who are in the middle on a boat trying to make it to the land? So when are they somebody's responsibilities when it's international waters? Are they the British responsibility when they reach British soil? So that's sort of a debate that they're having. The United Kingdom doesn't really want to take that responsibility on. They're saying these are our borders. When they touch land, yes, we have to do something with it. They're now trying to think about maybe moving those people to Africa. Not entirely sure what the status update is there, but the papers will tell you, I'm sure. It would definitely be good also to keep an eye on all of these things for Britain Today. Anyway, watch the news, do the 60-second segment that the BBC does on worldwide news, anything to keep yourselves updated. So tourism is affected, obviously, so people are still going to travel to the UK and especially worldwide, but from the EU, it is easier to pick a different country. So apparently tourism will feel the effects also. And then, like I've mentioned, education, international students, major drop in international students. And education, as we'll get to later, as I've mentioned, is seen as sort of like an elitist thing anyway in a lot of places in the UK. And if there's no international or very few international students coming in, would that get better or worse? So that's also something that remains to be seen. So leaving Brexit behind for now, let's focus on some of the situations in the United Kingdom at the moment that you'll see in the news, or at least in the newspapers, on pretty much a daily basis. First one is cost of living crisis. So like as in the Netherlands and in lots of other places, cost of living has gone up. However, the social security system in the United Kingdom is starkly different from the one in the Netherlands, and we're going to have a look at what that means and how that happened. So one of the things that's worth mentioning is they are, I've noticed in my brief time in the United Kingdom, they do tend to protest for lots of things. I've seen a lot more of that there than I saw here so far. So there's lots of people collecting themselves, gathering in like big public areas like Trafalgar Square in London and major places in different cities, all have signs and they come together and it's relatively peaceful. So you can see an example of that here. You know, heating is not a luxury and fuel poverty. So during the reign, let me call it that, of Liz Truss, for instance, but before that as well, there was a lack of fuel. So actually like petrol stations would close down. They were closed. There was no fuel. People would rush to different places to like fill jerry cans with fuel so that they could drive to work in the morning. So there were people who lost their jobs because they could not afford the fuel to go to work, which is something that might be, I mean, it sounds crazy to me, but it's just like it was a reality. So the same thing goes for something like heating. So they do have central heating there. Obviously, they have heating systems, but if you don't pay your bills, if you're sort of like, if you're not somebody who's reliable as a customer, so meaning you don't pay your bills on time, that means that that's something called a credit score. So if you live in the UK, you have to build up a good credit score. And the way that you do that is you pay your bills on time, and then you can use that as proof. And the bank keeps an eye on your account, and they sort of track how reliable you are as a customer paying your bills every month. And so the more unreliable you are, the higher certain costs will be. So if you're trying to get a new phone contract, but you don't have a good credit score, they will still give you a phone contract, but your monthly fee will be higher, which is just basically coming down to the less money you have, the higher your bills will be, which is a system that starts to become like a vicious circle, right? It's very difficult to break out of that. And they don't have like an uitkering the way that we have here. They have job seekers allowance. They have something called universal credit. If you're not able to work, if you don't have any sort of income, you can apply for something called universal credit. We're going to have a look at that. But one of the consequences is also, for instance, if you're not a good customer and you don't pay your heating bill, the company can put you on a meter, meaning somebody will come into your house and put a meter on your central heating and your heating system that you actually have to put coins in or put money on. And you have to go to like, you know, like the places where you like a tobacco shop or something where you can buy cards that have money on them that you can then put on your meter so that you can buy your heating that way. And then if you don't have any money, you don't have any heating. So in the Netherlands, it's true that if you don't pay your bills in the winter time, they're not allowed to evict you from your home because it's the winter time and they're not allowed to do that. Like, you'd be cold, you'd freeze to death or something like that. No such rule in the UK. So if you don't pay your bill, it's not easy necessarily to evict you, but if you don't pay your bills, it's not like, oh, but it's the winter time, let's give these people something anyway. That's just not the situation. So universal credit, I just mentioned it briefly. So universal credit is something that you can apply for if you don't have any source of income. It's quite a complex system. There's different things that you can apply for if you don't have a job but you're looking for one, like a UFA here, which means that you do have the obligation to apply for jobs, and you get something called a job seekers allowance. So a job seekers allowance at the moment is like £84 a week if you're 25 and over. And you actually have to go and collect that from a job center. They might have changed that during COVID times, but before that you could actually see people line up and go and collect their money. And then you can have universal credit, which is sort of like an outcaring. And you can see the monthly allowances here on the screen. So if you're single, you're 25 or over, so that would be me, for instance, I would get £368 a month. Now, I'll let you do the math on how much you can actually do with that kind of money. The answer is not a lot. So how are people supposed to live off this? And then if you don't pay your bills again and again and again, your cost for your contracts would go up and up and up. And this is one of the reasons that the UK, even though they seem rich, there's actually is a country that has a lot of poverty. So London has a lot of money, but not necessarily the rest of the nation. And part of this is also, it's good to remember that we have like cao's here in the Netherlands, and that's not like a norm in the United Kingdom. So there's no such thing as holiday pay that you're entitled to. You're not necessarily entitled to like a pay rise when, like, based on inflation, for instance, that the unions here would fight for. So obviously they have lots of unions and different companies offer different things, but you don't get to see, like here in the Netherlands, if you see a job ad, it will list like how much money you'll probably be making, or it'll give you a range. That's not true. When you live there, so you apply for a job, you have to then go into negotiations about your salary, and you would also negotiate about different things like this. You could negotiate saying, every year I want to sit down and talk about a pay rise, but it's not a given. So we've talked a little bit about the cost of living crisis and the protests that have to do with that. Another one that you'll see a lot and that we have here as well all over the world is Extinction Rebellion. They call themselves XR. So they fight for the environment. And so I've put on the slide here, you don't need to know all of this, but it is good to know, what do they actually want? What are they fighting for? Why are they doing what they're doing all over? So there was a protest, I think last week or last weekend in The Hague as well. A lot of people got arrested. So they were founded in 2018 in the UK, but they now have 485 affiliates across the globe. That's quite a growth, right, in such a short time. So what do they want? Like, their main issues are, they want carbon emission reduced to net zero by 2030. So I think, as I recall, that the Dutch government had said before that they would try to do this. It doesn't seem to be a very achievable goal, but I'll be the first to admit that this is not my niche. So I don't necessarily know everything about this. So they do want very much at pressuring the government to declare the climate situation, the crisis, an emergency. Because if the government officially declares something an emergency, they can act on it, and they have the power to spend more money on it. So that's something that they're really pushing for. And they want policy changes, and this is what it says in their sort of like in their outline. I don't want to call it a manifest. So in their outline is policy changes on the basis that transition has to be equal and fair for future generations. So what they're saying is, right now the most vulnerable are suffering the most and are paying the highest price, and that's not fair. So right now, the people who have caused these problems, that generation will die out, and it will be up to the young to deal with the consequences, and that's something that they're really fighting very actively against. They're protesting this. So what is it that they do that's different from before? I wouldn't say that it's different, because protests and civil disobedience have been around since humans have been around, but they don't believe that like petitions and protests and things online work. So they've said you have to go out into the street, but it has to be non-violent. So they're doing something called non-violent civil disobedience. rebellion. And if you, maybe there's some of you that are members, if you want to join them, then you have to sign something called the Rebel Agreement. And the Rebel Agreement very clearly states that there shall not be any violence whatsoever against anyone and anything. So they do break things. They break things, not people. And then the idea is if there are legal consequences for your actions, you have to sort of man up and own them. So no hiding from the law. Having looked at Brexit and having looked at the cost of living crisis and Extinction Rebellion, we're now going to go into a section that is more affiliated with culture wars. So this is the opening slide of that. I will leave the notes in the actual notes margins for the PowerPoint so you can have a look at those. The PowerPoint will be up on Moodle as well. So we're going to go into the first one. So arguably the biggest one and the most memorable one, I mean, it's still in the news, it still happens, it comes in peaks over the past couple of years, is the Black Lives Matter protest. So this took place all over the globe. I'm sure everybody remembers, in response to George Floyd being killed in May 2020. And so it hasn't died down in that sense. It was just massive then. And this took place all over the country. So there's been a lot of talk, and the newspapers reported very heavily on it. So some newspapers focused very much on the protest themselves, and it was largely peaceful. But some of the things that happened, so for instance, people would destroy memorials, statues of, for instance, former slave traders or colonialists, people that they didn't feel deserved to have a statue for the things that they'd done, or despite things that they'd done. So for instance, in Bristol, they pulled down a statue and tossed it into the water. And so the government passed a bill that said that increased prison sentences for destroying a memorial like that. And they also very recently, in response to several protests, so not just the Black Lives Matter protest, passed a bill that would limit your options in terms of peacefully protesting and having the right to gather and protest. So it is still allowed because it's like a constitutional right. But it does make it easier to decree a protest not peaceful, and it would allow more police force action. So we're going to have a look at the police specifically as well. So one of the reasons that this took place in the UK, apart from all the massive reasons around institutional racism, is a couple of very specific events that happened that we'll go into very briefly. The next slide in this PowerPoint is a song by a rapper called Dave. He has a song called Black that he performed at the Brit Awards, and he goes into his experience of what it means to be Black in the UK and also addresses the audience there. So he was nominated and won Album of the Year then he took that opportunity of his performance to address the public, but also to address the Prime Minister very directly. I very much recommend listening to that. It's an excellent performance, but it's also super informative. So the thing that Dave mentioned at the end, the Grenfell victims still need accommodation. That refers specifically to the Grenfell Tower that you can see here. It's a high-rise building in North Kensington in London, where a fire started on the 4th floor. As I recall, the cause was a faulty fridge. The result is that 72 people died because the fire service were too late in advising residents to evacuate, and 151 homes were destroyed. And as it turns out, the building had not been structurally sound and was not compliant with safety regulations, and people had been aware of that for quite some time, but were too late to do anything about it, or had not done anything about it despite knowing the risk that this posed. So this was seen as, so it's not the first time that a building catches fire, and it's not even the first time that it would happen in a neighborhood that is predominantly non-white, but this was seen as sort of it became like a symbol of saying, this is what happens to people that the government doesn't care about, because this was in 2017, and as of now, people are still waiting for new permanent accommodation, which seems unreasonably long, and it seems fairly straightforward that if people have already admitted to their fault and said yes, no, it wasn't structurally sound, no, the building wasn't compliant with safety regulations. Yes, this was our fault. Why have these people still not been offered new homes? It is a lawsuit against the state. However, a lawsuit against like a government branch takes years and years and years because they can bury you in paperwork. And as of now, it's still not resolved. The second thing Dave mentions is the Windrush Generation. So the Windrush Generation refers to people, as it says on the slide, it refers to people who arrived in the UK from the Caribbean between 1948 and 1971. So the Windrush is the ship that they came in on. That's why the picture is also on the slide. And sort of like the ship, like Windrush, became like a symbol for everybody who entered the country during those times. And so they became manual workers, cleaners, drivers, nurses. The NHS had just been established. So they were granted leave to remain in the UK. And so they were never supposed to have to go anywhere. They'd been granted permission to stay. They were British citizens now. However, the government never actually, in a lot of cases, not all of them, but in many cases, never actually issued the paperwork that would give them the actual proof. So the people who had been granted this permission should have received like literally a piece of paper that, like we all do when you apply for citizenship or like a visa somewhere, you get a piece of paper or a stamp of your passport or something that you can use as proof and say, look, I have been told that I am allowed to stay, I live here, I belong here. But because it didn't happen, and the government apparently destroyed a lot of like landing cards belonging to the Windrush migrants, these people were unable to prove that they were in the country legally. And so if you can't prove that you're in the country legally, you're prevented from accessing healthcare, work, housing. So these people, they were massively affected by this. And this is called the Windrush scandal for that reason. And they are still waiting to be compensated. And so some people had also actually been deported, even though they'd been there like forever. All right, so we looked at the cost of living crisis, we looked at Brexit, we had a look at the Black Lives Matter. Hopefully you've had a look at Dave. So now we've landed on Reclaim These Streets. So Reclaim These Streets is not new. This wasn't like thought up suddenly like a couple of years ago in the UK, but these are protests, vigils for women threatened on our streets. So this is very much aimed at like violence against women. And we're going to have a look at why that suddenly sort of came to a head a couple of years ago and why it's still very big now. Actions against violence against women are also not new, far from it. This, however, reached a new low or high, depending on how you view it, in 2020, also during COVID. So I think it's also vital to remember that during COVID, especially during the first lockdown, so the COVID lockdown rules in 2020 during the first wave of COVID in the UK, they were very strict. They were stricter than they were, for instance, in the Netherlands, especially in the first year. So the UK sort of like went on full lockdown quite quickly and remained that way for quite some time. We weren't really allowed to leave our houses. They literally removed like benches from public areas so that people couldn't sit down and have a chat. You were allowed to go to the supermarket, but you had to prove that you'd been there. And there was kind of a lot of police afoot to check up on people. So it was a very restrictive time. People didn't have a lot to do anyway. So anything that happened, like the Black Lives Matter protest, but also something that we're going to go into now, like the Reclaim These Streets actions, they drew a lot of attention because there was literally nothing else to do. So I do think that matters in terms of how big some things can become. And I'm not saying that's not a bad thing, but it is something that I think plays a role here. But that might be something that you feel very differently about, which is all good as well, of course. So this is a watershed moment. A watershed moment is a moment that sort of changes things, like a pivotal moment, a turnaround. And I wouldn't call this a turnaround because I don't think legally things have changed, but it did have its effect, like a profound effect on some things. So what happened is during the first COVID lockdown, a woman called Sarah Everard was kidnapped and murdered and a lot of other horrible things happened to her, and the person who did it was a police officer. So he worked for the London Police, the Metropolitan Police, the Met Police Force. You can find them in London at Scotland Yard. And so he was arrested not long after. And people responded to that in a very intense way, because she was somebody who was sort of doing, and that's literally what the sign said as well, she did everything right. She was on the phone, she was walking home, it was not very late, she wasn't in a dangerous area, she stayed inside in view of the cameras, she had like her keys as like a little bit like homemade weapon, but she was approached by a police officer who told her that she was breaking COVID law and that she had to come with him, and so she did, and then she was found a couple of days later. And so the idea was, okay, this is like a police force that is meant to keep us safe. The Met Police makes up 25% of the nation's police force, so it's huge. And there's so much crime in the city. And now it turns out that the police officer is actually guilty of like the worst crimes. And so after that happened, a lot of more cases came forward. And it turns out that this police officer had several complaints filed against him already that were sort of like disregarded by the people in charge. And then it turns out there were lots of other police officers who had complaints against them. So this called into being a review, like an independent research review done by Louis Casey. So it's called the Casey Report. And so what Louis Casey discovered was that there was a shocking amount of crimes committed by Met police officers that were covered up, and so she brought to light in a very big report, and that report was released in March 2023, so earlier this year, not that long ago. It took a long time. That the Met Police is misogynist, homophobic, and racist, and so the conclusion of that report boiled down to get yourself sorted, or we might actually have to break up the Met Police force. So the consequences of that are like nothing that has institutionally changed, but it had been, as it came out, it had been reported several times over through the decades how corrupt, institutionally corrupt the police force is, and how the people in power had sustained this, or maybe even contributed to it, or were part of the problem. And so that's something that's come into view now. And one of the reasons that people wanted or sort of demanded this action is when Sarah Everard disappeared, some members of the government came forward and said, and I think it is important here that they were also men, came forward and said, look, literally said, women have to be wise when they go out into the street. You have to think before you leave with somebody. And then people said, okay, but this was a police officer. If a police officer comes up to you and says, you're breaking the law, you have to come with me, you go with them. And then they said, well, you have to use your brain. And if you don't trust it, you should try and flag down a bus and ask the bus driver to help you. So obviously this was mocked endlessly. I mean, that is not a proportionate response, or in fact a useful one. So there was a lot of anger around this issue. So it's not really about Sarah Everard, even though what happened to her is horrible. A lot of horrible things have happened to a lot of people as a direct result of being like victims of the people that are supposed to be there to protect and serve. And so the Met's slogan, so to speak, is policing is not done to people, but with their consent and in support of them. So you can imagine maybe that would not sit well with people. And that report has now come out and basically said, okay, something's got to change, but how are we going to do this? Because it's like trying to turn an oil tanker around just by pushing at it. You know, that's an ongoing process. We'll see how it is, but you'll see a lot of mentions of it in the paper. A bit more lighthearted would be the Partygate scandal. So the Partygate scandal has been very hard to miss, even in different countries. Refer to the COVID lockdown parties that were held at Downing Street or government places by Boris Johnson government members. His defense has been these people were at work, thinking about work and talking about work, and the fact that they were having cheese and wine during very strict COVID lockdowns doesn't really change that fact that so they were at work, so it was not illegal. This did not sit well. So he didn't actually, he wasn't forced to resign or anything because of this. Like Boris Johnson has been able to survive a lot of the scandals to do with his government. But this was during a time when, like I said, the lockdown was very strict. So if you were spotted at the train station, for instance, and you didn't have a reason to be there, like you couldn't prove that you absolutely had to be there, the fines were quite high. So you would be fined like £1,000 for just being at the train station because you were not supposed to be near other people. It was sort of like a wartime reporting. They had big posters everywhere that said, you know, think about the people next to you, make sure that, you know, you're not part of, like, make sure that you're not a killer. So then to see the government who are dictating these rules and setting these high fees and high penalties and fines, and to see them having like these cheese and wine parties. And also they weren't upfront about it, so this was all discovered later by people who had taken pictures and then leaked it to the papers. So there were a lot of parties and people were quite angry about it. What I did think is worth mentioning, which is what you can see on the slide, is that after one of Boris Johnson's press conferences in defense of like, oh no, we were working, we really were working, is they organized a work meeting at number 10 Downing Street, where everybody had to come dressed up as Boris Johnson, so they could also think about work. And thousands of people showed up, which I did think was very funny. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, and he was the one who campaigned and promised people to get Brexit done. And he did, in fact, get Brexit done. And there was a lot of scandals surrounding him, and it had to do with his private life and with
Tony,
his
yesterday I went,
girlfriend and his children and his wife,
as we all must,
and just basically anything that he does.
to Peppa Pig World.
The parties that he
I don't know if you've been
had
to
and
Peppa
all the
Pig
laws that
World.
he
Who's
broke,
been to
but
Hands
he
Up anyone who's
survived
been
all
to
of
Peppa
those
Pig
scandals.
World?
He never resigned. What led
Not
to his
enough.
downfall as a Prime Minister in the end
I was
the fact
I was a bit
that
hazy what I would find at
we've
Peppa
had,
Pig World,
like, the Black Lives
but I
Matter,
loved
racial
it. Peppa Pig
injustice
World is
protests,
very
and
much my
climate
kind of
protests,
place.
and then reclaiming streets, violence against women
it
protests,
has
and then it turns out that
very
a
safe
member of
streets,
his parliament had a lawsuit going against him
discipline
that
in
was also
schools,
about sexual misconduct. And
heavy
it turns out
emphasis
that
on new
Boris
mass
Johnson
transit
knew
systems,
that
I
he'd
noticed,
done that, and
even
that
if they're
case
a bit
was ongoing,
stereotypical
and he
about
gave him
Daddy
a
Pig.
prominent position anyway.
But the real lesson for
So
me,
at this
going to
time,
Peppa Pig World, I'm
that did
surprised you haven't
not
been there,
work out well for him, so he did
was
actually have
about
to
the
resign.
power of UK creativity.
Here on the slide, you can see his famous or infamous Peppa Pig speech. I would like to explain to you what he's talking about, but the thing is that nobody knows. He lost his place when he was in a room full of business leaders. It was in November of 21, and he started talking about Peppa Pig and his young son. The other video is Matt Lucas, which is a British comedian,
The pace of change
imitating Boris Johnson
is now going
during
to accelerate
his also
like a
often
new Tesla.
nonsensical
Because I can tell you, as a
press conferences that took
former
a long,
motoring
long
correspondent,
time
EVs
and
may
never
not
really
burble
said
like
anything. So a
sucking
lot of
doves,
the
and they may
time
not
at the end of the
have
press
that rum,
conferences,
rum, rah, rah,
people
that you
have to
love.
ask him,
But they have so much
so
torque
what are
that
you
they
saying?
move off the lights
And I'm
faster
sure that
than
was the
a
same
Ferrari.
here in the Netherlands as well. But this might be worth watching to get an impression. Why was he so popular? That is something, he's seen as somebody who has a lot of charisma. He doesn't feel fake. He says things like they are, and that's what people liked about him. So a lot of the British people seem to also think that he is genuinely a very charming man. So he still is very popular. So the person following Boris Johnson as Prime Minister is Liz Truss. She is the shortest serving PM. She was only in office for 44 days. However, within those 44 days, very importantly, Queen Elizabeth II died. That was 2 days after Liz Truss had become Prime Minister. I mean, that seems like quite a stressful start of your job. So you don't need to know everything about her, but it would be good if you know who she is. And so these pictures were all over the paper, I think all over social media at the time. Will Liz Truss outlast this lettuce? There wasn't a lot of confidence in her anyway from the get-go. And then after she had resigned, quite tellingly, I think the day or 2 days or something before she resigned, she was on the news in a press conference saying, I am not a quitter, I am a fighter, I will not resign, I will keep going. And then she was forced to resign very shortly after. Made it even more painful in terms of like memes and social media jokes. So you can see like the lettuce Truss projected here onto Parliament. So you don't need to know everything about this. What is important is that she lifted the ban on fracking during her days in office. So fracking is short for hydraulic fracturing, which basically means, and this is far from my expertise, is that water, sand, and chemicals are pumped into a well so that the gas trapped in the well explodes back up. So this is how you reach gas, for instance. And there's a ban on this because it contaminates water, it can cause earthquakes, it contributes to climate breakdown, and there's been a ban on it for a long time, but she lifted that ban, or since a long time, like the 2000s. She lifted that ban because she thinks, we need these natural resources. And that was also part of the disaster. So a lot of things happened during her 34 days that just resulted in her having to resign. When her foreign secretary, Braverman, resigned, she wrote a very angry public letter about Liz Truss and how she had no confidence in her abilities as a prime minister. And that led to a lot more people in her government resigning and writing a similar letter. So it was basically a hot mess, unfortunately for her. So the current Prime Minister is Rishi Sunak. He is the leader of the Conservative Party. It says leader on the slide. I apologize for that. It's supposed to be Conservative Party. And he reinstalled that fracking ban. And he is in office now. So definitely remember the first Prime Minister. You know who Boris Johnson is. And please remember the current one also. On to royal scandals. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because the PowerPoint is already quite long, and I think a lot of people already know quite a bit about the royal family. I mean, they are in the news every single day, even internationally. So let's have a look at like the most important moments very briefly. The royal family, the firm is what it's called. It's like, it is run sort of like a company. If you've ever seen any of the interviews like with Diana or with Meghan and Harry, the interviews that they've done, for instance, with Oprah, or during the documentary that I think when they went on a trip to Africa, they talk about the firm, meaning the way that not necessarily specific royal family members, but just the way that sort of like the company, the crown, is run. And so the crown also doesn't refer to just like the actual physical crown, but also the job. Now, it is important, no matter how interested or disinterested you might be in the UK royal family, there's lovers and there's haters. They are for sure very popular, but whether you hate them or like them, people feel strongly about them one way or another. And I struggle to think of a royal family anywhere else that is treated so much like a sort of like pop star sensation. Like they are in the tabloid magazines every single day. You can buy t-shirts with their faces on it. You can have like spoons and plates and whatever you like for whatever you want in your house with members of the royal family on them. And I don't think, I mean, we have a royal family in the Netherlands and they are, I think, reasonably well liked, but I don't see people walking around with sweatshirts that have like Amalia on it. So that's different here. So Diana might have contributed to this. She was very, very beloved. Famous interview, the 1995 BBC interview, that became sort of like a scandal later on because, as it turns out, maybe the BBC had acquired the rights to that interview in very shady ways. Apparently, the journalist who interviewed her had lied to her about certain things to convince her to do the interview, and there's like a review pending. We'll leave that up to like the expert, I suppose, or maybe if you are the expert, do get in touch. I'd be curious to know about it. But what is important to remember is that Charles and Diana married. He was 32, and she was 19, as I recall, 18 or 19 years old. So it was supposed to be sort of like a fairy tale wedding. And it wasn't. So he had not been in love with her ever. Anybody who's watched their engagement interview, so when royals get engaged, they do an engagement interview. And he said, we're in love, or whatever that is. Doesn't sound like he was just so in love with her. Apparently he was then still in love with Camilla, who he had been with since, or during his college days. So he is a few years younger than Camilla is. And Diana very famously said, there were 3 of us in this marriage, is a bit crowded. And that became a line that sort of like that will never disappear. There's no escaping it for Charles and Camilla. But I mean, I suppose they got there happily ever after. They are now king and queen of the United Kingdom. And Diana unfortunately died in 1997 as a result of a paparazzi chase. There's a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding her death as well. So if you're interested in that, watch the documentaries, have a look at what was written about it. It is certainly something that keeps coming back, also because Harry and Meghan feel they're experiencing a similar sort of relationship with the press, and he feels quite limited in his options as well, the same way that Diana has said she felt. So William and Kate, so Prince William, Prince of Wales now, he is the next in line, so the heir to the throne has the title the Prince of Wales, so that is William now. Obviously his wife is Kate. She's very, very popular and has been pretty much since the beginning. I think that he and the royal family have grown more popular since Kate, especially because their popularity died down significantly after the death of Diana, because the people, like Diana was so well loved, and she had spoken out about her experience within the firm and how she had felt unwelcome and criticized, and the press haunted her, but she also knew how to use the press. So she snuck in reporters into Kensington Palace to have that interview there, and that was a big scandal because you're not supposed to even set foot near it without everybody knowing 6 days in advance. And the actual term is 6 days. So when Kate came into the picture, they called her Waity Katie, because apparently she waited for William to propose to her for such a long time, and it was like a breaking up and getting back together. And Taylor Swift would have had something to say about it, I'm sure, the sage of our time. So they have been together for a long time now. 20 years. I think they got married in 2010, so 13 years then. So their wedding was a huge celebration in the country. People are very much concerned with how they're doing and with their marriage. And I mean, there's always rumors in the newspapers that he cheats on her a lot and that he's having a lot of affairs. It only makes people like her more. I think that were they to split up, then he would lose a lot of popularity and she would gain popularity. The Kate effect refers to the fact that she is sort of considered a fashion influencer. She apparently boosts the UK fashion industry with about $1 billion per year. Just basically anything that she wears, people will buy. So there's Meghan and Harry. Harry is William's younger brother. So Harry is never gonna be king. I mean, they have to be very odd. But he feels that he resembles his mother the most, and he very famously stepped away from his royal duties, also as a result of marrying Meghan and Meghan not being welcomed into the royal family. So they are in the papers a lot, and they've got a Netflix documentary, they've got a podcast on Spotify. He is churning out books. The first one was released this year. It's called Spare. Apparently there's going to be 4 other installments. People loved them quite a lot, I think, when they first got together. But within the UK, they're not popular at all. They seem to have more of a following in the US. For sure, like one thing's for certain, they did step away from their royal duties. She was not present at the coronation of King Charles. He was there, but he was only there for 2 or 3 hours, and then he left again, flew back to the States. So they live in Montecito now in California, and they seem to be doing a lot of other things. They do still have their titles, and the firm has announced that because, like by decree of Queen Elizabeth when she was still alive, their children will also just inherit their titles. I'm sure there's loads of people that know a lot more about Meghan and Harry than I do. It is true, and part of that is in next week's lecture, but it would be worth saying here because Dave also mentions it, that the press in their reporting style talk about Meghan in a way that is completely different from how they talk about Kate, even if they are doing the exact same thing. So there's a slide in next week's lecture, but also you can just Google it and you can compare headlines as to how they're spoken about in the UK press, and that is interesting to have a look at. So finally, Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew is King Charles's younger brother, and he was married to Fergie, the red-headed lady you can see in this picture, the top picture. And the bottom picture is a picture taken with a young American girl who filed a lawsuit against him for sexual abuse. So Prince Andrew had ties to convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, who committed suicide or was found dead in his cell, I think a few years ago now. He's just sort of like fallen from grace. He was stripped because that became famous. So the idea is, or the rumor is, that people very likely had known about this for a very long time, but always sort of like kept it on the down low, a hush hush. But when Jeffrey Epstein was convicted, and the people that were like in his inner circle were also convicted, or at least found themselves in the midst of big lawsuits, the United States government doesn't care that Prince Andrew is royalty. He would have been called to court in America because this is an American girl and it took place on American soil. So this lawsuit would have taken place in the United States before an American court, which probably would be a jury. And I think they wanted to. I think that's obviously, I'm basing this on the things I've read. They would have wanted to avoid this. So he settled for, I think, about £12 million, so that he wouldn't have to appear before a court. And he's sort of retired from like the public duties now. So he was stripped of his titles, and he is no longer allowed to perform any royal duties. So the final slide of this hour-long lecture is about the coronation in particular. So one of the slides in the PowerPoint says, fuck the coronation, feed the poor. So I've put that in here because I think it's important to know that even though the coronation was celebrated and they painted like a very charming picture of it on the news, it was a hideously expensive event, and these are some of the things that made the papers the next day. So Katy Perry was there to perform as the major headliner, and she was dressed apparently as a Quality Street chocolate. So she had on some sort of like golden wrapper dress. The reviews were quite nice about her, but they did say, you know, why was all this money spent when people don't even have heating, no petrol, no food? So this is something that King Charles is not immensely popular, and neither is Camilla. Even if the royal family is quite loved by many people, it's not necessarily King Charles who's the most popular. A television show like The Crown on Netflix would have only made that worse. That actor is wonderful, but he does not paint a good picture, and a lot of it is apparently based on truth. So that harms their reputation. So King Charles has tried to sort of modernize his coronation. It was shorter. There were more people involved. There were more religions involved. There were more cultural backgrounds involved. We'll have to see how popular he will actually be and how long he will be on the throne. Obviously, it's until death. But I think it is good to remember that even though people celebrate this and it seems like the royal family is super important to like the entirety of the UK, that is very much not true. And then finally, so the next couple of slides, some of the slides don't play a role, and so they're just still in there for you to have a look at, but there's nothing in there that's not in the book or in this lecture already. It is important to know a little bit about the press, especially like the broadsheet versus the tabloid press. So you don't need to know all of the newspapers or all of the television programs, but it would be good to know that there is such a thing as the BBC and ITV, for instance, and also the difference between broadsheet papers and tabloid newspapers. So like tabloid newspapers are more like tabloids. They're a bit gossip. They're very gossipy. They are very colorful. They usually have like very splashy headlines. They've got lots of pictures. They're literally smaller, like a tabloid, and the broadsheet newspapers are maybe like the bit more serious press. So have a look at the difference between those, and also remember some of the big names. Like The Guardian would be more of a left-leaning newspaper, where, for instance, The Telegraph might be more of a right-wing newspaper. So The Sun, The Mirror, it would be good to know some of these, what they look like, what they tend to report about.